So first of all, I'm assuming that if you're all here, you're all interested in knowing a little bit more about UX and UI design and what it takes to become a UX UI designer. As Yara said, my name is Elia. I'm a UX UI designer with a few years of experience in the industry, and I've joined Recoded as head of UX UI design instructions. In over the last few years, I've transitioned from roles in pure design toward role in education, in design education, because I really like to have the chance and the opportunity to help people shaping the futures, acquiring skills and knowledge that they need to have in order to become designers. So I'll be happy to answer all of your questions regarding what are the steps in order to become a designer, or what you should be focusing on in order to change your career. So this is the agenda for today. So we're going to start with a quick definition of what is UX design, what is UI design, and what makes them different. Then we're going to focus on the UX process. I don't know if any of you is familiar with the idea, but don't worry. We're going to explore it together just to see what this is about and how do we use it in our daily life. Then we're going to focus on the skills of a UX and UI designer. So if you are willing to become a designer, you will have to acquire a certain amount of skills. And we're going to give a look at which skills you need to collect in order to become one. That's okay. I'm gonna get started. Specifically talking about what is UX and what is UI. It might not sound like a complex question, but actually coming from a place in which UX and UI weren't very old disciplines, but relatively new disciplines, it is somehow important to start by defining clearly what these two disciplines are about. In fact, some people tend to spend a lot of time trying to identify the differences between the two. I'm not a fan of that idea. I'm more of a fan of the idea that UX and UI design are somehow the two different faces of the same coin. But at the same time, it is important that we understand what are these differences and why do we have the need for two different names. So first of all, UX design stands for user experience design, as opposed to UI design that stands for user interface design. Now, I would like you to focus on essentially the first word of both disciplines. So user appears in both the names, and this is something that we're going to give a look at in a moment, but that's something that we need to start getting familiar with. Like, it's a concept that we need to familiarize with. In fact, the users play a crucial role in our work of UX or UI designers. Everything we do is about the users. And as we will see in a moment, the user sits at the center of all of our processes, reflection, action, and choices. The second word I would like you to focus on is what characterizes the two disciplines. So on one side, we have experience, and on the other side, we have interface. As we will explore in a moment, UX and UI design look at the same thing, which is the digital experience, but from different scales. In fact, user experience design can be applied to any sort of experience. It doesn't have to be linked to a digital product per se. It's more of a cognitive science. In fact, it can be applied to all sorts of interaction. We experience stuff every day, and our experience can be linked to a digital product like a website or an app, but it can also be linked to all sorts of physical products like a coffee machine, an ATM machine, going to the supermarket. All of these things can be designed because all of these things imply the experience of a user interacting with something. Now, a company can have multiple facets of interaction, and they can present themselves to a user via digital product, physical products, services, experiences, and all of these things are the object of the attention of a UX designer. UX design was born as a non-digital discipline. In the words of its founder, Donald Norman, UX design is the design of pretty much all sorts of experiences, from the first interaction with a brand up to the very last interaction with the last page of the website. Everything we do to interact with our users requires a work of understanding of our users. And this is what UX is all about. So UX is not about the visuals, but it is about the experience themselves. The questions that we ask ourselves are, what is the user experiencing while using this product or service? How do we want them to feel like while they use this product or service? And in order to answer all of these questions, we need to go through a certain set of steps that will allow us to acquire a certain understanding and knowledge regarding the user needs, their behavior, and what they're actually looking for. On the contrary, UI, it's all about visuals. And in fact, UI, as I mentioned already, stands for user interface design. Now, bear with me, an interface can be any kind of interface, but in the common language, we refer to visual interfaces primarily. Recent technologies are starting to explore also the design of auditory interfaces, for example, or interfaces that requires different types of interaction. But for the sake of this conversation and to keep things more accessible, we're going to focus on visual interfaces. That's to say, the mean by which we interact with websites or apps. As you can imagine, UX design focuses more on the abstract experience, while UI design is a discipline that allows us to design the detail of that experience, down to the nitty-gritty detail of how is a button reacting when I tap on it, what's the color scheme that I'm going to adopt. And for this reason, visual design includes a crucial role in our work of UI designers. But UI design is not just about visual design. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the need for a different name. We would just call ourselves visual designers. What makes a difference between visual design, in general visual design, and UI design is that in UI design, we still take with us all of those mental models that we apply also to UX design. That's to say, concept relatable to the usability of a product, how easy it is for a user to learn how to use a product, the cognitive processes that stand behind the interaction with the product, all things that in visual design we don't take into account. So in UI design, we don't design with the final product in mind, but we actually design with the final interaction in mind, the final user in mind. And this is what makes the biggest difference between, the classically intended visual design and UI design on the other side. Because the reason is that users want to have the most intuitive experience possible. So when we design an interface, our main point of attention is put into making the interface as intuitive as possible. In other words, we need to create the conditions so that the user doesn't have to think before doing something. The interaction with a product, so a website or an app, should come as natural as possible so that the user can actually minimize those feelings of frustration that most of the time are associated with the discomfort or the problem that we are trying to solve with our specific product. Second requirement and responsibility of a UI designer is to make sure that the ecosystem of visual assets that gravitates around the product itself are consistent and coherent and aesthetically pleasing. So in this case, the aesthetic of the product somehow play a certain role in the conversation, but once again, is not the center of the attention. The center of the attention is how easy to use the product is, how intuitive the interface is. So in a nutshell, you don't need to be an artist or Michelangelo in order to be an extremely good UI designer. When I started working as a designer, I was quite bad at drawing, honestly. And that's something that I learned, by doing. And in fact, you don't need to have any sort of artistic skills, extremely advanced artistic skills in order to be a UI designer. The reason why I underline this aspect is that most of people are kind of scared by UI design because they believe that they need to have a certain artistic taste for colors, the drawings, and all that jazz. That's not the case because UI design is not about visual composition per se, but visual composition derives from different types of reflection. Like, as I said, how easy to use is this interface, how intuitive it is. So to recap, we have on one side user experience design, that is the design of the overall experience. And on the other side, we have UI design, which is the design of the mean of interaction between a user and an object or a product. As you can imagine, when we design the experience, we include also the interface. But it's not true the contrary. When we design the interface, we're not designing the overall experience. So in a way, I like to look at UI design as a sister discipline of UX design, is that part of the experience that focus 100% on the visuals, the product interface, and the actual interaction between the user and the product. For this reason, as we said that UX design focuses on the overall journey, we can say that UI design focuses on the interface, like the visual interface, focuses on the interaction, what kind of animation do we have in place, what kind of color schemes, how responsive the design is. So all of those things that can make the quality of this visual interface, the best that we can. So UX and UI share something, and we already highlighted that U that stands at the beginning, and that U stands for user. But they share also the mental model that we adopt in order to, start from the initial problem to get to the end, the final idea. And this thing that these two disciplines have in common is the methodology that we adopt. This methodology that we can call the UX process comes directly from what is called design thinking methodology. The design thinking methodology is a methodology, an approach to design that puts the user at the center of the conversation and goes through a series of iterative steps in order to start from a problem and end up with a solution. When I say iterative steps, I mean that every step of the process doesn't just happen once, but it is something that happens recursively, because the idea is that we start by knowing little about the problem of the user. And the more we go through the process, the more we learn about these two things, the problem and the user. And at every circle, we know a little bit more about them. The process never virtually really stop. It stops when we either run out of budget or we find a optimal solution for our problem. But virtually, we could go on and on and on and on, implementing what we have already designed. And if you think about, famous products like Facebook or Instagram, famous digital products that everyone is pretty much using, you will realize that they are constantly changing. They are constantly adding features, removing features, changing the interface, changing something, moving stuff around. And that's because, it's a process that we can define as a try and error process. We start by formulating hypotheses. We try to test those hypotheses. We identify possible solutions that are aligned with those hypotheses, and then we test it. And when we test, the test can go well, meaning that we have we had formulated the right hypothesis, or it can go not so well. So it means that we need to go back to square one and start over with new hypotheses. Now, there are a lot of models that visualize this concept. This is one that I particularly like because it essentially focuses on two levels of information. On one level, we have the different phases of this process. This process starts with what we call the empathize phase, whose main scope is identifying the problem and what is the user experiencing. Then we have the define phase that allow us to collect observation, clearly define a problem statement, and clearly define who are we designing for. Then we have the ideate phase that allow us to start brainstorming solutions, the prototype phase that allow us to translate these abstract solutions into tangible deliverables and outcomes. And then we have the testing phase that pretty much allow us to start with these tangible outcomes and deliverables and put them to the test, just to see if everything we have decided so far makes sense, it is aligned with the reality of the problem, and it is aligned with the user expectations. The second reason why I like this visualization is because of the second level of information. On this second level, we have this symbol here, the infinite symbol. And this is exactly suggesting that idea that I was introducing a few minutes ago. At the end of the testing phase, what happened is that we go back to the first phase. And that's what I mean when I say that this is an iterative process, because now we definitely know a little bit more than what we knew at the beginning of the process. So we are ready to start over this cycle once again, enriched with some more knowledge about the user and their problem. Now, we could virtually say that this side of the process focuses on the context, and this side of the process focuses on the form. In fact, this side of the process is characterized by what we call user research. And user research is all about understanding that context. What is the user doing? Who is the user? Where is the user? What is the user doing? And what is experiencing in general? On this side, instead, we take everything we've learned from here and we try to find a solution that makes sense in light of that knowledge. So we try to shape a solution by defining features, aspects, once again, how is this product going to work, and all that jazz. At the center, we have testing, because testing is pretty much a contact point for all of these different phases. We can start testing as early as here, literally, and it's actually that we should actually be doing, because the sooner we start testing, the sooner we can validate our assumptions. Now, what makes this process work is that, as I mentioned already, and that's exactly what characterizes UX and UI, the reason why it works is because it is 100% focused on the user. And this is what makes UX and UI different from any other form of design. We design constantly looking at our user. We design by looking at their needs and their behavior. We never design something just for the sake of how nicely it looks or how cool it would be. UX and UI design has nothing to do with aesthetic or how cool a product can be. A product is cool if it is meaningful, and it is meaningful if it is actually solving a real user problem. But now, as you can see, the conversation around UX and UI is very open to interpretation, in the sense that we can design anything we want. We can start from any place in that process, and we can design for all sorts of users. So how, as designers, can we prepare ourselves in order to be able to approach such a high level of complexity? It can sound difficult, but really there aren't too many skills that we need to acquire. Essentially, I like to characterize the skills that we need into two big families. On one side, we have hard skills, hard not in the sense of difficult, but in the sense of opposed to soft skills, which is the second family of skills. Hard skills regard all of those things that are subject specific. So the theory of UX, the theory of UI, some theory of visual design, techniques for user research, principles of web design, how to create prototypes from paper, from digital softwares, whatever it is, principles of accessibility. All of these things and more are actually things that you can learn, for example, going through a course in UX and UI, because these are subject specific. It means that these are all principles and pieces of knowledge that we can acquire just by focusing on subject specific disciplines, like in this case, all those things that you need to know in order to know the foundation of UX and UI design. But in order to become a very good UX and UI designer, hard skills themselves are not enough. We need also to top them up with soft skills. And soft skills are all about being able to interact with people. As UX and UI designers, we need to relate and interact with the users. And the best way to do it is by nurturing a set of skills that are actually quite important skills to have in any working environment. But in our cases, even more. When I say that one of the very first phase of the process was called empathizing, you can imagine how important it is to be able to empathize with people, because there is no empathizing phase without our ability to empathize with people. So the most important soft skills that you need to acquire are Active listening for starters. User research is all about active listening and active observation. When you ask a question to a prospect user, when you try to investigate a problem, you really need to be able to listen beyond the words. The last thing we should do is asking us to our user, what do you need from me? Because the user most of the time don't even know what they need. They just know that they are feeling a discomfort, they are feeling a problem, experiencing a problem, and it is our job to identify the root cause of that problem and find the best solution possible. So that's what active listening stands for. It means being able to listen to what the user is saying or observe what the user is doing and actually interact with it, like engage with it, be present and understand more than what the user is saying. Empathy is a consequence of this. Being able to put ourselves in the shoes of a user is what allows us to design all sorts of products. Example, I don't like sport, period. Like, I don't like it, but I might have to design an app for sport passionate, or people who really like football, or people who really like to stay up to date with the most relevant information and news about sport. Does that mean that because I don't like sport, I cannot design such a product? Absolutely not. My first job is to understand that word, and I can understand it by interacting with the users, the end users of this product. So I need to be able to empathize with them, put myself in their shoes in order to understand their real problems. Emotional intelligence strictly relates also to this idea. Emotional intelligence means being able to, once again, experience the discomfort of your users, being able to come up with solutions that take into account their emotional response to these problems and the emotional response to the interaction with a product, and do something about it. I don't know how many of you have ever experienced a very badly designed website that is super frustrating to use. Think about a website that when you click on a button does nothing at all, or it's super slow, so it never loads, and it starts building up frustration in you. Now, as a designer, we are responsible for that frustration. And as designers, we need to be able to minimize that frustration. And that is what emotional intelligence is all about in our field. It's trying to foresee the discomfort or frustration or negative experiences that the user might be experiencing and put our knowledge at the service of this to minimize it as much as possible. On top of that, we have communication skills, self-leadership, teamwork, that are all things that we need to have, because design is never a one-man job, a one-person job. Designers always work in team. Sometimes are designers teams, so more designers working on the same product. Most of the time are cross-functional teams, like designers working with developers, working with marketers. So to be able to build something that makes sense and is actually feasible, we need to be able to communicate effectively with these people. And we need to have a certain sense of self-leadership, because we need to be held accountable for what we need to do. So all of this can be summarized in this idea of being an extremely good team player. Then, although it's not directly linked to design per se, it is a crucial skill to have.